2005, The History of Britain's Gulag. And that was a story of how the British essentially incarcerated, tortured, and abused people from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya because they were caught up in the Mau Mau uprising as violent freedom fighters in Kenya in the 50s and early 60s. And during this entire episode, when she published her book in 2005, she was attacked for exaggerating the story of Britain's violence against against the colonies and against the people of the colonies it occupied, until in the course of all of this, the British stumbled across an archive of hidden files, which revealed that everything she said was not just true, things were actually much worse, and in the files there were similar accounts from 37 different countries that the British had ruled. And that's what led Caroline to expand her work from a focus on Kenya. She is an expert on Africa. From a focus on Kenya to looking at the patterns around the world as a whole, and that's what led to this book. So I'm going to get Caroline to tell us a little bit the story of how she actually did her original research and that led to this work, and then we'll talk about some of the issues that has been raised by her pioneering research and writing. Welcome, Caroline.
Well, thank you so very much, and thank you for those wonderful introductory words, and my gratitude to all of you for being here, to the organizers for so kindly inviting me, and for those lovely initial words of introduction. And thank you for inviting me, Shashi, on the, just sort of what brought me to writing. As you said, this, if all else fails and you buy the book you don't like, it will hold your door open in the biggest windstorm that there's ever been. But you know, my first book was called Imperial Reckoning on Kenya and detention camps in the 1950s during the Mau Mau emergency. And as you gestured to, this book really looked at the systematized violence that took place at the end of empire in Kenya. And we certainly had indications of, if you will, one-offs, indications that the detention camps weren't necessarily all about hearts and minds, but I really sort of dove into this and in some ways excavated what some folks say the untold story. I think others have certainly written about it, detainees, but be that as it may. When I was working on this, I felt as though I had also dropped into a moment of time, right? That there were colonial officers who had been in Malaya and elsewhere, came into Kenya. They then left and went to places like Cyprus, and all of these different parts of the empire had enormous states of emergency, draconian kinds of violence that lasted for many, many years. And so when I finished up the book on Kenya, I really thought I wanted to explore this sort of how and why was this happening. Kenya was this moment in time. But as you gestured to, the first book, Imperial Reckoning, I was, we spent some time over breakfast this morning and recounted to everybody what I was telling you, which was, you know, I was a reasonably young sort of historian at the time, and I kind of thought that the first book on Kenya would elicit some pushback. It was just a tidal wave of, some of the, I had one reviewer say Professor Elkins is a young American woman, full stop, and I was accused of blood libel by our friend Andrew Roberts. I mean, it really sort of went on and on. But what happened is that a few years after the book was released, and it did have some acclaim, I would say critical acclaim with emphasis on the critical, and there was a human rights, and there still is, a law firm in the UK named Lee Day, and they decided that they were, for reasons of the claimants wanting to push forward, that there was a suit to be had against the British government. And Imperial Reckoning became the first time, the book that became the basis for the research, the first time the British government had been sued by a former colonized population. The case was filed in 2009. And I was expert witness to the case, which, by the way, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. That was a full-time job. And it was partway through that case that, as a response to consistent requests for document discovery, that the British government announced, they called it sort of a special hearing, that they had discovered 300 boxes of previously undisclosed files on Kenya that had been packed up and spirited away at the time of decolonization. And then another eight.
Some place in Northumberland called
Hanslope Park, which is also known as Spook Central because it's where they keep all the MI5 and MI6 files. And next to these 300 boxes of discovered...
They keep all the files they haven't burned, because the British burned a lot of files.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I haven't gotten there yet, right? Lots and lots. And you know, Red Fort here, I mean...
There was smoke billowing into the skies of Delhi throughout 1947.
Yeah, exactly. And so, look, you know, I'll sort of cut to the chase, which is the case ended up being much against the odds that many people said. The case was successful. The British government ended up paying out £20 million sterling the first time. It was as close as you're going to get to an apology and a statue to the victims of colonial torture in Kenya. And it was the first time that they acknowledged that torture had happened in the empire. But as we know, the debate still goes on with historians, and in some ways, this is where we intersect, right? Because, you know, I'm doing all this, I'm in the process of writing this book, and your book comes out in 2017, and the difference between those 12 years, and so, and I'm actually curious with you as we sort of think about it, I see, you know, ourselves as sort of united in this, this effort to move the dial on how we're thinking about the past and empire. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Well, I don't think in India we had many illusions. Perhaps some people did. But if you look at the British in the 19th century, from the start of the century when they shot people in the so-called Vellore mutiny, right up to the brutal suppression of the, again, so-called mutiny in Delhi, they just massacred people indiscriminately. 100,000 men, women, and children were killed on the streets of Delhi in putting down the so-called Sepoy mutiny. And these were not Sepoys, these were civilians. We had incident, I recounted one incident in my book, An Era of Darkness, where a young British, you know, Tommy, overhears a conversation that he can't understand between two people speaking to each other in Hindi or a dialect of Hindustani, in which they use the word Kanpur. They never have been telling each other that they come from Kanpur or that they're going to Kanpur or whatever. But the moment he heard Kanpur, he said, oh, they're talking about the mutiny, and he just massacred them. I mean, he just killed them. And this is the sort of stuff that, and he testified with pride, that's what he did. There was whole-scale killing, and Jallianwala Bagh was simply the apogee of something. But in terms of numbers, when you massacre 100,000 people in Delhi, then killing 2,000 or 3,000 in Jallianwala Bagh must have looked like, you know, small change to those who did it. So I think you have to acknowledge that violence was integral to the colonial project. And what I think is interesting is that in the second half of the 19th century, for the first time, at